In the dust-swept hills of southeastern Turkey, beneath the weight of 11,000 years, stones wait in darkness. They have been waiting longer than cities, longer than kingdoms, longer than the first seeds of wheat were pressed into cultivated earth. They wait with the patience of mountains, with the silence of stars that burned out before human eyes learned to read their light. These are the stones of Göbekli Tepe, the Bella-shaped hill, and they hold within their weathered surfaces a story that rewrites everything we thought we knew about our own becoming. Close your eyes and imagine a world without walls. A world where humans moved like water through landscapes thick with wild grain and aurochs, where the boundary between human and animal was permeable as morning mist, where the sacred was not housed in buildings, but breathed in every stone and stream. This was the world of Göbekli Tepe's builders, a world we can barely glimpse through the accumulated centuries. A world that existed before agriculture, before pottery, before everything our textbooks told us was necessary for civilization to begin. The pillars rise from earth like memory carved in limestone. T-shaped monoliths, some reaching 16 feet toward a sky that has turned 11,000 times since human hands last touched their surfaces with reverence. They stand in circles, these silent witnesses, arranged in patterns that suggest ceremony, that whisper of gatherings we can no longer reconstruct, of prayers spoken in languages that dissolved with their last speakers millennia before writing was invented. What drove these ancient peoples to move mountains of stone without metal tools, without the wheel, without domesticated animals to bear the burden? What vision compelled them to carve creatures into limestone lions and serpents, foxes and scorpions, vultures spreading wings wide as sorrow when their days were already consumed by the relentless demands of survival in a world that offered no guarantees? The answer, if there is one, sleeps in the spaces between the stones, in the chambers buried beneath earth, in the negative space where what we don't know eclipses everything we think we understand. This is not a story of conquest or kings, of empires rising and falling like tides. This is a story older than those narratives, stranger than our modern minds can easily accommodate. It is a story of humans who worshipped before they farmed, who built temples before they built homes, who understood the sacred in ways we have spent 10,000 years systematically forgetting. In their stone circles, they left us questions instead of answers, mysteries instead of explanations, and perhaps that was always the point. As you settle into the quiet of evening, as the day's noise begins its slow dissolution into night, let these words carry you backward through time to a place where humans stood at the threshold of everything we would become. Let the stone pillars rise in your mind's eye. Let the carved creatures prowl through your imagination. Let yourself wonder, as those ancient pilgrims must have wondered, what it means to be human in a world still being dreamed into being, still soft with possibility, still close enough to the beginning that the old gods had not yet fully retreated into myth. The stones are waiting. They have always been waiting. And in their patient silence, They hold space for a mystery that no amount of excavation can fully illuminate the mystery of what we were before we became what we are now, and what we might have lost in the long journey between then and here. Let us descend together into the chambers beneath the Bella-shaped hill. Let us stand among the pillars and feel the weight of forgotten centuries pressing against the thin membrane of the present. Let us remember what has been lost, and in remembering, perhaps touch something essential that still pulses beneath the surface of our too modern lives. This is Göbekli Tepe. This is the temple before time. This is where our story, or one version of it, begins. Before the first wheat bent beneath human hands, before the first wall rose to claim Earth as property, before the concept of civilization had coalesced into anything resembling what we now call society, there stood pillars in a place that memory cannot reach. Göbekli Tepe, the Bella-shaped hill, holds stones carved when the world was still being dreamed into form, when the line between the sacred and the ordinary had not yet hardened into the rigid boundary we now take for granted. Beneath the accumulated dust of Anatolian centuries, beneath the patient weight of 11,000 years, the stone circles wait in darkness. They descend into earth as though reaching for something older than memory itself, perhaps the first prayer, perhaps the first question that rose in human consciousness when our ancestors looked up at the stars and wondered if the universe was looking back. Each T-shaped pillar rises like a silent guardian of forgotten liturgy, their limestone faces weathered by epochs that have no names in our calendars, no place in our linear understanding of time. They stand taller than two men, some weighing 16 tons of carefully carved stone, their surfaces marked with symbols and creatures that speak in a language we can see but no longer read. The pillars are patient. They have stood through the rise and fall of empires that were themselves ancient when Rome was young. They remember what we have forgotten. Who lifted these monoliths when civilization was not yet a word, when the stars were closer, and the boundary between human and sacred was thin as morning mist? The question hovers in the air of the excavated chambers, unanswerable, essential. These were not farmers, for farming had not yet been invented. These were not city-dwellers, for cities existed only in futures these builders would never see. These were hunter-gatherers, nomads, people who followed the herds and the seasons, who knew the landscape as intimately as breath knows lung. And yet they built, they carved. They moved mountains of stone with a precision that suggests not desperation, but devotion, not random effort but systematic vision, not simple survival but something stranger and more essential, the need to mark the sacred, to create threshold between ordinary and extraordinary, to build doorways to the divine in a world where the divine was everywhere and nowhere, immanent and transcendent, close as breath and distant as the edge of the known world. The chambers themselves suggest ritual rather than habitation. No hearths mark the floors, no domestic debris speaks of daily life. No storage rooms, no sleeping quarters, no evidence that anyone ever lived among these pillars. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement but a destination, not home, but a place one traveled to from elsewhere, carrying whatever was sacred enough to warrant the journey through landscapes still wild with dangers we can barely imagine. Around the central pillars, carved creatures writhe in stone serpents and scorpions, foxes and birds of prey, wild boars and aurochs frozen in eternal motion. What did they guard? What threshold did these ancestors mark with such devotion that they invested generations in work that would outlast their great-great-grandchildren's grandchildren? The creatures offer no answers, only their patient stone presence, their watchful, eternally open eyes. The pillars stand in circles like witnesses to a ceremony lost to time, like guests at a wedding where bride and groom have long since returned to dust, like mourners at a funeral for gods whose names we never learned. In their shadows, we discover that our histories were written in sand, that everything we believed about our becoming must be unwritten and rewritten in starlight and stone, that the neat progressive narrative from primitive to civilized collapses in the face of these impossible monuments. Here, in this sacred belly of earth, humanity was not yet fully human in the way we use that word now. We were something else, something perhaps closer to the earth and the animals and the cycles of the moon, something we have spent 10,000 years systematically becoming other than. We were builders of temples before we were builders of homes. We were makers of sacred space before we were makers of private property. We were worshippers before we were workers, pilgrims before we were settlers, dreamers before we were practical. The pillars remember this. They stand as evidence that our trajectory was never inevitable, that the path we took was one among many possible paths, that we chose or perhaps were chosen to become farmers and city builders and empire makers, but that other ways of being human were not only possible but actual, not merely theoretical, but carved in 16-ton blocks of limestone that have outlasted every certainty we thought we possessed. As night deepens and the modern world's noise fades to background static, imagine standing among these pillars. Feel the cool stone beneath your palm. Smell the dust of 11,000 years. Hear the silence that is never quite silent, that hums with the accumulated prayers of countless pilgrims whose faces we will never know, whose names were never written, whose gods we cannot name but whose devotion carved mountains and moved earth and left us standing here, bewildered and blessed, in the presence of mysteries we cannot solve but can perhaps, if we're quiet enough, begin to appreciate. The pillars stand. The chambers wait. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Bella-shaped hill, the questions multiply like stars emerging as darkness deepens, each one bright and distant and utterly essential to the impossible task of understanding what it means to be human, to be conscious, to be the species that builds temples to mysteries we cannot name, and then forgets we ever built them at all. Deep in the carved limestone, creatures emerge from shadow into half-light, their forms pressed into pillars as though caught between worlds, suspended in the moment between flesh and symbol, between the actual and the archetypal. These are not mere decorations, not simple artistic flourishes to beautify sacred space. These are invocations, whispers from a consciousness that saw in animals something we have lost the eyes to perceive, messages written in a symbolic language we can see but no longer fully speak. Lions prowl in frozen eternity across the stone surfaces, their muscles coiled in permanent readiness, caught forever in the moment before the spring, the pounce, the kill. Their carved eyes stare from limestone faces with an intensity that suggests they are not representations of lions, but something stranger, perhaps the essence of lionness itself. The pure distilled power that made the lion sacred to peoples who knew it as both threat and teacher, as both enemy and spirit guide through the dangerous wilderness of becoming human. Serpents undulate across stone bellies, spiraling upward toward some celestial meaning we can no longer name, their scales carved with such careful attention that you can almost feel them moving, almost hear the whisper of scale against stone. In cultures around the world, the serpent has always represented transformation, the creature that sheds its skin and emerges renewed, the being that moves between earth and water, between visible and hidden, between the known world and the underworld of dream and death. What did these serpents mean to the pilgrims who came to Göbekli Tepe? What transformations did they seek? What skins did they hope to shed in the ceremonies conducted among these stone circles? Scorpions raise their tails in warning or blessing after 11 millennia. The difference is unclear, the meaning dissolved with the last speaker of the language that could distinguish between threat and promise, between danger and initiation. Perhaps the scorpion's sting was not something to fear but something to seek, a necessary pain that marked passage from one state of being to another, from initiate to initiated, from questioner to questioned. Foxes dance across the pillars with a lightness that defies the weight of stone, their carved forms suggesting movement and mischief, the trickster energy that appears in every mythology that has survived long enough to be written down. The fox in countless traditions is the boundary crosser, the clever one who moves between worlds, who tricks and is tricked, who reminds us that the universe is not a stern judge, but a playful mystery that delights in paradox and refuses to be pinned down by our too simple categories of sacred and profane, divine and earthly, serious and playful. Vultures spread wings wide as sorrow across the stone surfaces, their presence heavy with the weight of death and transformation, of flesh returning to earth and bone remaining as the essential self. In ancient Anatolia, vultures were not merely scavengers but sacred cleaners, psychopomps who carried the dead from earth to sky, who consumed the temporary flesh and left only the permanent bone, who performed the essential service of transformation that all living things must eventually undergo. To see vultures carved here is to see death not as ending, but as passage, not as loss, but as necessary transformation. Wild boars charge through barriers that exist only in stone, their tusks and bristles carved with such attention to detail that you can almost hear them snorting, almost smell the musk of their wild bodies. The boar is strength without restraint, power without civilization's polite boundaries. The untamed force that civilization will spend the next 10,000 years trying to domesticate, contain, and ultimately destroy in the service of progress and safety, and the illusion of control. What ceremony required such fierce attention to fang and feather, to scale and claw, to the wild things that prowled the edges of firelight? The people who carved them moved through a landscape thick with spirits, where every creature held a doorway to the divine, where the boundary between human and animal was not the rigid wall we now imagine, but a permeable membrane that ritual and trance and vision could cross in both directions. Perhaps these pilgrims, for surely they were pilgrims, not farmers, not settlers understood animals as we understand words, as symbols carrying weight beyond their flesh, as messages from a universe that spoke in form and movement rather than in the linear syntax of language. A vulture was not merely a scavenger, but a teacher of the mysteries of death and renewal. A serpent was not merely danger, but the very principle of transformation itself. A lion was not merely a predator, but power personified, the fierce and beautiful violence that underlies all life. In the darkness of these chambers, surrounded by stone witnesses whose meanings have slipped through our fingers like water, humans gathered beneath carved constellations of creatures and felt themselves part of something vast and woven, a tapestry where every thread mattered, where human and animal and spirit were not separate categories, but aspects of a single unified mystery that we have spent civilization learning to fragment and forget. Now we stand before their work with our fragmentary knowledge, our partial translations, our archaeological precision that can measure and catalog, but cannot resurrect the consciousness that saw these animals as sacred teachers. We can describe the carvings in minute detail. We can date the stone to within a century or two. We can map the chambers and measure the pillars and catalog every creature carved into limestone. But we cannot speak the language these creatures spoke to their carvers, cannot hear the stories told about them around fires that burned out 11,000 years ago, cannot feel what it felt like to be human in a world where animals were not merely resources or threats, but fellow travelers through the mystery of existence. The animals watch still, patient as the stone that holds their forms. They watch us with our clipboards and our cameras, our theories and our excavations, our modern certainty that we understand the past better than the past understood itself. They watch and wait, these carved creatures, holding meanings we can sense but not quite grasp, truths that hover just beyond the edge of translation, in the space where image meets imagination and memory dissolves into dream. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the animals carved in stone at Göbekli Tepe were never meant to be fully understood by those who came after, by those who would inherit a world so different from the one in which they were carved that translation would be impossible, meaning would be lost, and all that would remain would be the patient stone presence of mysteries that refuse to be solved, that insist on remaining mystery, that remind us that not everything worth knowing can be known, and that the questions we cannot answer might be more sacred than any answer we could construct. The stone sanctuaries do not stand in lines or grids, do not follow the orthogonal logic that would later dominate human building. They curve, they encircle, they embrace empty space as though the void itself were holy, as though what mattered most was not the stones, but the absence they contained, not the structure, but the space for gathering, for ceremony, for transformation that occurs only in the presence of others who have also made the pilgrimage to this threshold between ordinary and sacred. 4 great circles have been excavated, and ground-penetrating radar whispers of more still buried. Speaking from beneath the earth in frequencies our instruments can barely detect, waiting with the patience of stone for the day when archaeologists will brush away their covering soil and bring them blinking into light. Each circle holds paired pillars at its center like sentinels, guarding a threshold we can no longer cross, like doorposts marking an entrance to mysteries that have been sealed shut by the accumulated weight of forgetting. Around these central pillars, smaller stones form walls that suggest boundary without closing, that mark sacred from profane while allowing moonlight through the gaps, while permitting the wind to carry prayers skyward, while creating division that is porous rather than absolute. These are not defensive walls meant to keep enemies out. These are ceremonial boundaries meant to mark transition, to say to the pilgrim, you are crossing now from the ordinary world into sacred space, from the daily rhythms of survival into the timeless realm of ceremony and symbol and communion with powers that exist beyond the merely human. What gathered in these circles? Not families around hearth fires, no ash marks the floors, no cooking debris speaks of meals shared. No domestic waste tells of daily life lived among these stones. Not councils of elders debating territory, the circles feel too ceremonial, too precisely aligned with forces beyond the political, too saturated with the sacred to be merely functional spaces for human decision-making. Perhaps pilgrims came from distances we can barely imagine, walking for days or weeks through landscapes still wild with aurochs and gazelle, through territories marked by predators and weather and the 1,000 daily dangers that made survival in the Neolithic a constant negotiation with forces beyond human control. Perhaps they followed some call that sang in their bones stronger than hunger, clearer than reason, more compelling than any practical consideration, the call to gather, to witness, to participate in ceremonies that bound scattered bands of hunters into something larger than themselves. Perhaps they arrived at seasons we no longer observe, when the stars stood in configurations that held meanings now lost, when the moon wore names we never learned. Perhaps they came carrying offerings we would not recognize, bringing gifts for gods whose requirements have been forgotten, speaking prayers in languages that existed only in sound and never hardened into the permanence of writing. In the circles, they became something other than themselves, unified in ritual, dissolved in shared mystery, held within the curved stone arms of a cosmology that saw circles everywhere. In sun and moon, in the wheel of seasons, in birth and death, and the return of all things to their beginnings. The circle is the oldest sacred form, appearing in every culture that has left evidence of its spiritual life, from stone circles in Britain to medicine wheels in North America, from mandalas in Tibet to the round dances of indigenous peoples worldwide. The circle has no beginning and no ending, no hierarchy of importance, no head or foot. All who stand within it are equally distant from the center, equally part of the whole, equally necessary to the ceremony that joins many into one. The circles speak still, though we have forgotten how to listen. They draw us into their centers where we stand uncertain, modern and alone, trying to remember what it felt like to believe the earth itself was alive and paying attention, to know ourselves as participants in cosmic dramas rather than as isolated individuals pursuing private satisfactions. The circles remember what we have forgotten, that we are not separate from the earth, but expressions of it, that we are not observers of nature, but participants in it, that the boundary between human and world was always more permeable than our current worldview allows. Stand in the center of any circle, and you become the axis around which the world revolves. Stand in the circle with others, and you lose that centrality, become part of a larger pattern, a spoke in a wheel that turns according to rhythms beyond individual will. Perhaps this is what Göbekli Tepe taught, not doctrine or dogma, but the felt experience of belonging to something larger than the self, of being held by forces that existed before we were born and will continue after we die, of participating in patterns that connect us backward to ancestors and forward to descendants in an unbroken chain of ceremony and meaning. The stone circles of Göbekli Tepe are teaching instruments, each one a three-dimensional lesson in cosmology carved in limestone and arranged according to principles we can measure but not fully comprehend. They teach through form rather than word, through spatial relationship rather than linear argument, through the body's response to enclosure and the mind's recognition of pattern and the spirit's hunger for belonging that no amount of modern individualism can quite extinguish. As night deepens and consciousness begins its slow dissolution toward sleep, imagine standing in one of these circles. Feel the stones curved around you like protective arms. Smell the dust of 11,000 years. Look up and see stars undiminished by city lights, the Milky Way spilling across darkness like a river of light, like a path between worlds, like proof that what appears separate earth and heaven, human and divine, matter and spirit might be woven together more intimately than our categories allow. The circles remain, patient as breath, silent as stone, waiting for us to remember what we knew before we learned to build walls between ourselves and every mystery, before we traded participation for observation, before we chose certainty over wonder, and in that choice lost something essential to what it means to be fully human, fully alive, fully awake to the sacred dimension of existence that pulses beneath the surface of every ordinary moment, waiting only for attention, for recognition, for the willingness to step into the circle and let it teach what words cannot say. Perhaps strangest of all the mysteries that cluster around Göbekli Tepe like moths around flame, They buried it. After centuries of pilgrimage, after generations of ceremony conducted in these stone circles, after the investment of countless hours of labor moving and carving, and positioning these massive pillars, the people who tended this sacred place filled the chambers with earth and stone, covering the pillars as gently as one might cover a sleeping child, as deliberately as one might seal a tomb. Layer by layer, they entombed their temple, not in destruction but in preservation, not in abandonment but in some final act of devotion we cannot comprehend. They buried what they had built with such care. The backfilling was not random, not careless. It was methodical, purposeful, as ritualized as the ceremonies that had been conducted among the pillars for centuries. They filled the chambers with rubble and soil mixed with animal bones offerings, perhaps, for the journey into darkness, gifts for gods being put to sleep or sealed away, or transformed into something that required burial rather than continued worship. Why bury what you built with such care? What necessity drives humans to hide what they once held holy? The question haunts the site, whispers from beneath the accumulated earth, refuses to be laid to rest even as the pillars themselves were laid to rest beneath tons of carefully placed fill. Archaeologists offer theories shifting belief systems, changing climate, the transition to agriculture that required different gods, different rituals, different relationships to the sacred. But the burial feels too deliberate, too careful to be mere abandonment, too loving to be simple rejection. Some scholars whisper of catastrophe, of events that made the old ways untenable, that required the pillars be sealed beneath earth for their own protection, or for the protection of those who might otherwise be tempted to worship at altars that no longer aligned with the new world being born. Others suggest the slow turning of the world toward agriculture, toward settlement, toward a new way of being human that had no room for these stone circles and their wild mysteries, their ceremonies that required pilgrimage rather than proximity, their gods that lived in landscape rather than in temples built within the boundaries of cities not yet conceived. But the burial speaks of something deeper than practical necessity. There is care in it, reverence in the methodical filling of each chamber, love in the choice to preserve rather than destroy, to hide rather than to abandon openly. Perhaps they knew that what they were doing was important enough that future generations would need to find it, would need to excavate these mysteries and grapple with the questions they pose. Perhaps they were creating a time capsule, a message to the future that said, "We were here, we built this, we worshipped in ways you will not understand but which were real to us, which mattered more than you can imagine." Or perhaps the burial was itself a ceremony, a final ritual that completed some cycle we cannot perceive, that closed a door that had been meant to stay open only for a specific period, that fulfilled some cosmic purpose that made sense within a worldview we can barely glimpse. Perhaps in their cosmology, temples were not meant to stand forever, but to serve their purpose and then return to Earth, to be reabsorbed by the landscape from which they emerged, to complete a circle that began with stone raised from ground and ended with stone returned to ground. They covered the carved creatures and the watching hands, the circles and the pillars, the chambers where ceremonies had been conducted under stars that have since shifted in their courses. They buried the foxes and the serpents, the vultures and the lions, the scorpions and the wild boars. They filled the spaces where pilgrims had gathered and been transformed, where hunters had become something more than hunters, where humans had touched something beyond the merely human and been touched in return. Until the hill was only a hill again, unmarked and unremarkable to eyes that no longer knew what lay beneath. For 11,000 years, it slept. For 11,000 years, sheep grazed above forgotten sanctuaries, farmers plowed fields above buried pillars, and no one remembered. The knowledge passed from living memory into myth, from myth into legend, from legend into silence, until even the silence was forgotten and there was only the hill, patient and secret, keeping its mysteries sealed beneath the accumulated dust of centuries. Until a shepherd noticed worked stone among the rocks, until curiosity became excavation, until archaeologists began to brush away the earth and the centuries, began to uncover what had been so deliberately covered, began to bring back into light what had been consigned to darkness with such care. The pillars emerged blinking into modern sunlight, carrying questions we are only beginning to learn how to ask, challenging assumptions we didn't know we were making, forcing us to rewrite our histories and our understanding of who we are and where we came from. The burial preserved what open exposure would have destroyed. Wind and weather would have eroded the carvings, worn away the details, reduced the pillars to weathered stumps unrecognizable as the work of human hands. By burying their temple, the ancient peoples of Göbekli Tepe ensured its survival across an expanse of time, so vast it dwarfs empires and renders kingdoms into footnotes. Perhaps they knew this. Perhaps they understood that preservation sometimes requires burial, that protection sometimes requires concealment, that the most important truths sometimes need to sleep beneath earth until the world is ready to receive them again. What else sleeps beneath earth, waiting? What other messages from our ancestors lie sealed beneath hills that look unremarkable, beneath fields that have been plowed for millennia, beneath cities built on the ruins of cities built on the ruins of settlements that existed before settlement was a concept? How many other Göbekli Tepes wait in darkness, patient as the one that finally emerged, ready to challenge everything we think we know about our past and ourselves? The questions multiply in the quiet of evening, as consciousness begins its own burial beneath the layers of sleep, as thoughts settle like sediment and awareness dims toward the darkness where dreams wait. The buried temple speaks of cycles of rising and falling, of building and burying, of remembering and forgetting, and perhaps, if we're fortunate, of remembering again. And in that cycle, we glimpse something essential about the human journey, about the way knowledge is lost and found and lost again, about the patience required to let things sleep until the time is right for waking, about the trust that what matters most will survive even burial, even 11,000 years of silence, even our determined efforts to forget. They came from nowhere we can map. These builders who raised stones when the world was still learning what humans might become. When the trajectory from hunter-gatherer to farmer to city-dweller had not yet begun. When other ways of being human were not merely possible but actual, lived, real. No cities surrounded Göbekli Tepe. No walls marked territory. No granaries stored surplus grain against winter's hunger. The people who carved these pillars were hunters, gatherers, wanderers who followed game and seasons, who knew the landscape as you might know a lover's body intimately, without need for charts, through direct experience rather than abstract knowledge. How does a nomadic people build monuments that outlast empires? How do hunters organize labor on this scale, moving limestone pillars that weigh 16 tons without domesticated animals to bear the burden, without the wheel to ease the journey from quarry to temple, without metal tools to carve the stone, without the settled hierarchies we assume such projects require? The paradox haunts us because it challenges every assumption we've made about the necessary preconditions for monumental architecture, about the relationship between settlement and civilization, about what humans need in place before they can dream in stone. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture by at least 1,000 years. It predates pottery, that marker of settled life that archaeologists once used to measure the advance of civilization. It predates everything we believed necessary for the kind of complex social organization that could conceive, plan, and execute a project of this magnitude. It stands as evidence that our narratives were written backward, that we assumed civilization began with wheat and walls when perhaps it began with wonder, with the impulse to mark sacred space before marking territory, with ceremony before commerce, with temples before towns. Perhaps these pilgrims gathered in seasons of plenty, when the herds were thick, and the wild grains abundant enough that not every waking moment needed to be devoted to survival. Perhaps in their abundance, they found time for something beyond mere subsistence, for ritual, for ceremony, for the slow, patient work of carving questions into stone and arranging those questions in patterns that would outlast the questioners by millennia. Perhaps the temple came before the city because the sacred came before the secular, because worship was more fundamental to being human than ownership, because the impulse to mark what is holy preceded the impulse to mark what is mine. They left no written record of their names or their reasons. Writing would not be invented for another 6,000 years, and even then it would emerge first as accounting, as the prosaic necessity of tracking grain and debts, and property the mundane mechanics of settled civilization. The people of Göbekli Tepe had no such concerns, no property to track, no surpluses to account for, no kings or priests who needed their power legitimized through the permanence of written decree. What they left instead are stones arranged in circles, creatures frozen in limestone testimony, and the revolutionary suggestion that humans worshipped before they farmed, gathered for ceremony before they gathered for harvest, and understood the sacred long before they understood property. They left questions instead of answers, mysteries instead of explanations, and perhaps that was always the point, to create something that would outlast understanding. That would challenge every future generation to reconsider what they thought they knew about the past and about themselves. Imagine organizing a project like Göbekli Tepe without cities, without permanent settlements to house workers, without hierarchies to enforce compliance. Imagine moving 16-ton pillars through landscape using only human muscle and ingenuity, rope and lever, and the collective will of people who believed deeply enough in the importance of what they were building that they would invest years or decades in work that would not be complete in their lifetimes. Imagine carving intricate designs into limestone using stone tools, each blow of the hammer a meditation, each curve of serpent or fox requiring patience measured in hours and days and weeks. This was not slave labor coerced by kings. There were no kings, no slaves, no apparatus of state power to compel obedience. This was voluntary devotion, people choosing to invest themselves in creating sacred space, because the sacred mattered more than comfort, more than ease, more than the rational calculation of personal benefit that we now assume motivates all human action. These people built temples before they built houses, which tells us something profound about their priorities, about what they considered essential versus what they considered optional. The absence of cities around Göbekli Tepe creates a different kind of presence, the presence of a worldview we can barely imagine, where permanent settlement was not yet seen as necessary or desirable, where following the herds and the seasons was not poverty but freedom, where having no fixed address was not homelessness but home everywhere, where the landscape itself was dwelling place and temple and teacher all at once. Perhaps what we call the agricultural revolution was not progress, but choice, not inevitable advancement, but one possible path among many. Perhaps these people saw the future that was coming, the walls and the boundaries, the property and the hierarchy, the cities and the kings, and in some way were building Göbekli Tepe as a marker of what would be lost, a monument to a way of being that was about to end, a temple to the wilderness, and the sacred and the freedom that settlement would systematically destroy in the name of security and surplus and civilization. They gathered from the landscape and returned to the landscape, leaving only their stones behind, only their questions carved in pillars that would outlast every city that would ever rise and fall in the long centuries after they died. They had no cities, and perhaps that was not poverty but richness of a kind we can no longer recognize, wealth measured in mobility and mystery rather than in surplus and settlement, in freedom and ceremony rather than in property and permanence. As sleep approaches, and the boundary between waking and dreaming grows permeable as the boundary between human and landscape once was, consider what it might have felt like to be human before cities, before walls, before the world was divided into mine and yours, before the sacred required buildings to contain it, and could still be found in every stone and stream and star. Consider what we gained in our long journey toward settlement and what we lost, and whether the balance was always as clearly in our favor as we've been taught to believe. In one chamber, a pillar carries imagery that stops breath, that forces contemplation of what we spend most of our lives trying to ignore. Vultures circle a human form headless, falling, caught in the moment between life and what comes after, suspended in that impossible instant when everything that was becomes everything that will never be again. Below this stark scene, a circular symbol suggests wholeness or perhaps portal, a doorway drawn in stone where flesh meets mystery, where the known world gives way to whatever lies beyond the last breath. Scholars call it the vulture stone, but such naming feels too small for what it might contain, too prosaic for imagery that speaks directly to the oldest human fear and the oldest human question. What happens when we die? The stone offers no comfort, no promises of paradise or threats of punishment, only the stark image of vultures doing what vultures do, transforming flesh into absence, returning the temporary to the elements from which it briefly borrowed coherence. In ancient Anatolia, vultures were not merely scavengers, but sacred cleaners, birds that carried flesh to sky and left only bone the essential self, purified by passage through the digestive system of these dark-winged psychopomps. Some cultures of the region exposed their dead on platforms for vultures to consume, trusting these birds to carry souls skyward, to perform the necessary service of separating what was temporary from what was eternal, flesh from essence, individual from universal. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe witnessed such ceremonies. Perhaps the stone circles served as sacred grounds where flesh was given back to sky, where the boundary between earth and heaven grew thin as the membrane between breath and stillness. Perhaps pilgrims came here not only to celebrate life, but to process death, to witness the transformation of loved ones from body to bone, from individual to ancestor, from particular to universal. Perhaps the chambers where we now stand with our cameras and our clipboards once echoed with mourning and prayers, with the rush of vulture wings and the sound of bones being carefully collected after the birds had done their work. The headless figure on the vulture stone speaks of transformation rather than violence. In the iconography of many ancient cultures, the removal of the head represents not destruction, but liberation. The head, seat of individual consciousness and ego, removed so that what remains might join something larger, something that existed before the individual and will continue after. Death as doorway rather than ending, as transformation rather than termination, as return rather than loss. Below the vultures and their headless charge, the stone is carved with scorpions and serpents, creatures that suggest danger and transformation woven together, death and rebirth as aspects of a single process rather than as separate states. The scorpion's sting brings death, but also healing scorpion venom in small doses was used medicinally in ancient times. The serpent sheds its skin and emerges renewed, dies to what it was and becomes what it will be, teaching by example the mystery of transformation that all life must eventually undergo. What did these pilgrims understand about mortality that we have forgotten in our sanitized modern distance from death? They lived close to it in ways we can barely imagine. Infant mortality rates. We would find horrific life expectancies that would seem tragically short, daily proximity to predators and disease, and all the thousand ways that life in the Neolithic could end without warning. Yet they did not turn away from death, but carved it into their most sacred pillars, integrated it into their ceremonies, made it part of the mystery they gathered to honor. Perhaps they saw what our culture has lost sight of, that death is not the opposite of life, but an integral part of it, not an aberration to be denied, but a transformation to be honored, not the enemy to be defeated, but the teacher to be respected. The vulture stone does not sentimentalize death or promise immortality, or suggest that the transformation is painless or easy. It simply shows what happens, what must happen, what always happens. Flesh returns to earth, bone remains as testament, and something we cannot quite name continues in ways we cannot quite describe. The circular symbol below the scene might be sun or moon, portal or shield, representation of wholeness, or of the hole through which the dead must pass to reach whatever lies beyond. Like everything at Göbekli Tepe, it offers multiple possible meanings and refuses to choose among them, holds contradictions without resolving them, asks us to sit with ambiguity rather than demanding the comfort of certainty. In our age that hides death in hospitals and funeral homes, that speaks of it in euphemisms and denies it through technology and medical intervention, pushed to the point of torture. The stark honesty of the vulture stone feels almost confrontational. Here is death presented without consolation or denial, transformation shown in its full stark reality, the sacred and the terrible woven together so tightly they cannot be separated. The stone stands in the darkness of its chamber like a koan carved in limestone, asking us to remember what we knew before we learned to fear silence, before we built walls between ourselves and every mystery that makes being human an impossible, beautiful burden. It asks us to consider what we lost when we stopped exposing our dead to vultures, when we started sealing them in boxes and pretending they were only sleeping, when we began to speak of death as though it were optional rather than certain, as though denying it might somehow make it less real. As consciousness settles toward sleep, toward that small death we practice every night, the vulture stone whispers its uncomfortable truths. It reminds us that we are temporary, that flesh is borrowed, that everything we cling to will eventually be taken by time and transformation, and the patient work of vultures, literal or metaphorical. It offers no comfort except the comfort of honesty, no promise except the promise that what is essential will outlast what is temporary, no hope except the hope that transformation might be doorway rather than ending, might be beginning disguised as conclusion, might be the gate through which we pass into mysteries we cannot name, but which waited before we arrived and will wait after we depart. Walk through the excavated circles and notice what is missing. Let your eyes search for hearths, but find none. Look for refuse piles from meals, but discover only earth and stone. Seek sleeping quarters, storage rooms, the 1,000 small evidences of daily life that mark every place where humans have actually lived, and find instead only ceremonial space, only sacred geometry, only the infrastructure of ritual rather than the detritus of domesticity. Göbekli Tepe holds no homes, no dwellings, no signs that anyone lived among these pillars. It was never a settlement but a destination, never home but a place one traveled to and from, carrying whatever was sacred enough to warrant the journey through landscapes still wild with dangers. This absence speaks louder than presence might, creates a negative space that outlines something essential about how these ancient peoples understood the relationship between sacred and profane, between ordinary time and ceremonial time, between the life lived day to day and the life that only manifests in special moments of gathering and transformation. The site was pure ceremony, undiluted by the domestic, kept separate from the daily rhythms of survival. No one cooked meals here. No one slept in these chambers. No one stored grain or tools or the accumulated possessions that mark settled life. People came here not to live, but to become something other than their daily selves, pilgrims shedding the ordinary like a worn skin, participants in ceremonies that required leaving behind everything familiar, everything comfortable, everything known. Around the stone circles, they gathered without settling, worshipped without inhabiting, and when the ceremonies ended, they returned to camps and caves and seasonal shelters scattered across the landscape like seeds scattered across ground not yet cultivated, not yet claimed, not yet divided into property and boundary, and all the structures that would eventually transform wanderers into settlers, pilgrims into residents, free-ranging humans into agricultural workers tied to specific plots of land. What power did this separation hold? In our age of collapsing boundaries, where sacred and secular bleed together until neither holds distinct meaning, where churches host bingo games and shopping malls become pilgrimage sites, where the distinction between weekend and weekday has dissolved into an eternal present of potential productivity, Göbekli Tepe suggests our ancestors understood something about the necessity of threshold, about keeping certain spaces untouched by the ordinary, about maintaining boundaries that create possibility through separation rather than through merging. Perhaps ceremony requires distance. Perhaps the act of approaching sacred space matters as much as what occurs within it. Perhaps transformation happens not in the temple itself, but in the journey toward it, in the leaving behind of daily concerns, in the slow shedding of ordinary identity that occurs when you walk for days through wilderness, carrying nothing but your intention to arrive at a place set apart from all other places, designated as different, marked as threshold between the world you know and the world you can only glimpse in moments of ceremony and vision. The absence of domestic life at Göbekli Tepe creates a different kind of presence, an emptiness that holds possibility, a silence that makes room for transformation, a space deliberately kept clear of the clutter that accumulates wherever humans settle and build nests and mark territory as their own. Here, nothing was cooked or consumed except mystery. Here, nothing was stored except questions carved in stone and carried in bone. Here, the normal rules were suspended and other rules applied, rules we can no longer articulate but which shaped the ceremonies conducted among these pillars for generations. Imagine the pilgrimage itself as the first stage of ceremony. Imagine leaving your camp, your band, your familiar landscape, and walking toward the bella-shaped hill with others who have also left behind the ordinary. Imagine the slow shedding of daily identity that happens during such a journey, the way normal concerns fall away like unnecessary weight, the gradual opening to something beyond the personal that occurs when you travel with sacred intention rather than practical purpose. By the time you arrive at Göbekli Tepe, you are already transformed, already different from who you were when you left. The temple receives you in this altered state, provides space for ceremonies that would be impossible in the context of daily life, among the hearths and the sleeping places, and the storage rooms where the ordinary accumulates and demands attention. Here, freed from the domestic, you can become what the ceremony requires: dancer, mourner, witness, participant in dramas that connect you to forces larger than yourself, to ancestors who walked this same path, to descendants who will walk it after you depart. And then you leave. You return to the domestic, to the camps and the daily work of survival, carrying with you whatever the ceremony gave you, whatever transformation occurred among the stone pillars in the darkness beneath earth. The temple remains behind, empty of human presence, waiting for the next pilgrims, patient as the stones that form its substance, silent as the mysteries it was built to honor. This patterned sacred space kept separate from domestic space, ceremonial time marked off from daily time, appears in cultures around the world and throughout history. But we have largely lost it, merged everything together in the name of convenience and efficiency, turned our homes into offices, and our offices into social spaces, and our sacred sites into tourist attractions where nothing is forbidden and everything is photographed, and the mystery dissolves into mere spectacle. Göbekli Tepe reminds us what we lost when we stopped maintaining these boundaries, when we allowed the sacred to be colonized by the domestic, when we forgot that transformation requires threshold and threshold, requires separation and separation, requires the courage to leave behind what is familiar and enter spaces that are deliberately kept different, deliberately held apart, deliberately protected from the ordinary concerns that otherwise consume every waking moment. As sleep approaches, and the day's concerns begin their slow dissolution into night's forgetting, consider what spaces in your own life are kept sacred, kept separate, kept clear of the domestic clutter that otherwise fills every corner. Consider whether you have any thresholds left, any boundaries that mark the difference between ordinary and extraordinary, any places you approach with the reverence these ancient pilgrims brought to their journey toward the bella-shaped hill. And if you don't, Consider what you might have lost in the merging of everything into everything else, in the collapse of all boundaries into a seamless continuity that recognizes no difference between sacred and profane, ceremony and routine, transformation and mere repetition of the already known. Some archaeologists whisper of astronomical alignments, of pillars positioned to mark solstices and equinoxes, of chambers oriented toward specific stars, now shifted in their ancient courses by the slow wobble of Earth's axis through millennia. The evidence remains suggestive rather than conclusive, tantalizing rather than definitive, but the possibility haunts the imagination. Did these pilgrims gather when certain stars rose above certain pillars, when the heavens aligned with stone in configurations that held meaning we can barely reconstruct from our position 11,000 years removed from the ceremonies that required such precise celestial timing? In an age before light pollution, before the electric glow that now drowns the night sky in a permanent twilight, the stars burned with a clarity we can hardly imagine. The Milky Way spilled across darkness like a river of light, like a path between worlds, like proof that earth and heaven were connected by luminous threads that anyone could see by simply looking up. Humans who lived without walls or roofs knew constellations with the intimacy we reserve for the faces of loved ones, recognized stars the way we recognize friends in a crowd, understood celestial patterns with a precision born from necessity and observation, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had watched these same lights wheel across the dome of night. Perhaps they read in stellar patterns the same narratives they carved in stone cycles of death and renewal, seasons of gathering and dispersal, the great wheel turning through darkness toward light and back again, in rhythms that structured time before clocks existed to fragment it into abstract units of hours and minutes. Perhaps the animals carved on the pillars were not merely animals, but constellations, star patterns that rose and set according to seasons, that marked times for hunting or gathering or traveling to Göbekli Tepe for ceremonies that could only occur when moon and star and planet aligned in sacred geometry. Perhaps certain ceremonies required specific celestial witnesses, could only occur when the heavens presented particular configurations, when the stars stood in positions that hadn't occurred for years and wouldn't occur again for years more. Perhaps the pilgrims who walked to Göbekli Tepe carried calendars written in bone and memory, marking time not by harvests, for there were no harvests yet, but by the slow wheeling of constellations across the roof of the world, by the rising and setting of planets, by the phases of the moon and the angle of the sun at sunrise on the longest and shortest days of the year. Modern research has suggested intriguing possibilities. Some pillars may align with the summer solstice sunrise. Others might mark the heliacal rising of certain bright stars. The circular enclosures themselves could be oriented toward significant celestial events, serving as both temple and observatory, both sacred space and scientific instrument for tracking the movements of heavens that governed the rhythms of life on Earth. But we must be careful not to impose our categories onto their understanding. We separate science from religion, observation from worship, practical knowledge from sacred wisdom. They almost certainly did not. For them, tracking the stars was not merely utilitarian calculation, but sacred observation. Not just a matter of knowing when to expect certain seasonal changes, but of participating in the cosmic dance, of aligning human ceremony with celestial rhythm, of recognizing that what happened in the heavens mattered to what happened on Earth because heaven and earth were not separate realms, but aspects of a unified whole. Imagine standing among the pillars on the night of ceremony, when the stars you've been watching for months finally align in the configuration that marks this moment as sacred time. Imagine the pillars rising black against a sky ablaze with stars, each constellation a familiar friend, each planet a known wanderer whose movements you've tracked since childhood. Imagine feeling connected not just to the people gathered around you, but to the cosmos itself, to forces so vast and patient that human lifespans are mere flickers in their eternal wheeling. We stand now beneath the same stars, though city lights have stolen most of their clarity, though satellites and airplanes clutter the space that once belonged only to celestial bodies, though our relationship to the night sky has become so attenuated that most people can't name more than a handful of constellations and have never seen the Milky Way clearly. We measure time in hours and seconds, in digital absolutes that bear no relationship to the patient turning of the cosmos. That fragment experience into units, so small they lose all connection to the larger rhythms that structured human life for hundreds of thousands of years. But at Göbekli Tepe, beneath stones raised when humans still lived according to celestial rhythms, we might remember what it felt like to organize life around mysteries larger than ourselves, to build temples that served as conversation between earth and heaven, stone and starlight, human ceremony and cosmic pattern. We might remember that we are not separate from the universe, but embedded in it, not observers watching from outside, but participants moving in rhythms we didn't create and cannot control, but can perhaps align ourselves with, can learn to dance to, can build our ceremonies and our calendars and our understanding of sacred time around. The stars that shone on Göbekli Tepe's ceremonies still shine, though they've shifted in their positions, though the constellations our ancestors knew have drifted through the slow precession of the equinoxes. The same light that illuminated those ancient gatherings reaches us now, photons that have traveled for years or centuries through the void to arrive at this moment, at these eyes reading these words about people who stood beneath the same stars and saw in them not distant balls of burning gas, but messages, meaning, the handwriting of gods or the pattern of cosmic order, or the map by which souls navigate after death. As consciousness settles towards sleep, as the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin as the boundary between earth and heaven once seemed, Imagine the pillars outlined against a night sky, undimmed by artificial light. Imagine stars so bright they cast shadows, so numerous they seem almost to touch, so clear in their patterns that you can read time itself in their configurations, can know where you are in the great wheel of the year just by looking up and seeing which stars stand above which pillars at which hour of the night. The stones remember. They stood beneath those stars for centuries before being buried, and they stand beneath them again now, patient as mountains, silent as space itself, holding in their arranged geometry some echo of the cosmic order they were built to reflect, to honor, to align within ceremonies that made humans participants in celestial patterns rather than mere observers of them, that wove together earth and heaven in ways we have spent the last 11,000 years systematically pulling apart. Beneath what has been uncovered, more circles wait in darkness. Ground-penetrating radar whispers of structures still buried, of chambers and pillars sleeping beneath accumulated earth like dreams we have not yet dreamed, like memories we have not yet remembered, like questions we have not yet learned to ask. The radar shows anomalies, signatures, patterns that suggest human construction hidden beneath soil and stone, and the patient wait of 11,000 years. Archaeologists estimate that only 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Let that number settle in your mind like sediment settling through water. 5%, which means 95% remains sealed, patient, holding secrets that will outlive everyone currently alive to wonder about them. 95% still waits beneath the Bella-shaped hill, undisturbed, untouched by modern hands, keeping its mysteries in darkness where mysteries perhaps prefer to remain. What lies in the unexcavated darkness? More carved pillars reaching toward Earth's surface like hands pushing up from beneath, like prayers spoken in stone hoping to be heard by generations not yet born. More circles marking ceremonies we cannot reconstruct, arranged according to principles we cannot perceive from our position so far downstream in time's river. Perhaps deeper chambers, older still, revealing that even our revised understanding of human prehistory remains incomplete, that we have only just begun to glimpse how long and strange our becoming has been. The buried portions of Göbekli Tepe exert a peculiar gravity on the imagination. They are simultaneous presence and absence known to exist, but unknown in their details, real but inaccessible, evidence of our ignorance preserved in stone and soil. Each radar image raises more questions than it answers. Each new survey reveals more of what we don't know, more of what waits to be discovered, more proof that every answer we uncover reveals deeper questions hiding beneath. Perhaps some secrets are meant to sleep. Perhaps the slow revelation across generations serves us better than sudden knowing, gives each age only what it can properly integrate, protects us from being overwhelmed by mysteries we're not yet ready to hold. Perhaps mystery itself is sacred, and the unexcavated chambers remind us to approach the past with humility, to remember that every answer uncovers deeper questions, that certainty is always provisional, That what we think we know about our ancestors and ourselves is only the thinnest layer of a much deeper truth. There are practical reasons for the slow pace of excavation. Archaeology is painstaking work, requiring careful documentation of every layer, every artifact, every scrap of evidence that might help reconstruct the past. Excavation destroys context even as it reveals content once you dig something up. You cannot put it back exactly as it was, cannot undo the disturbance, cannot restore the precise arrangement that existed before modern hands began their careful disruption. But there's also wisdom in patience, in letting the buried remain buried until the time is right for revelation. Each generation of archaeologists brings new tools, new techniques, new ways of seeing that allow them to extract information their predecessors would have missed. What we excavate now yields certain kinds of knowledge. What remains buried might yield different knowledge to different tools in different hands in different centuries, might answer questions we haven't yet learned to ask, might speak to concerns we haven't yet developed the consciousness to recognize as important. The sleeping chambers beneath Göbekli Tepe are not passive absences, but active presences, shaping the present through their refusal to be fully known. They humble us, remind us that we are not the culmination of history, but merely the current chapter in a much longer story, not the final answer, but merely the latest question. They insist that the past is not a closed book we can read and file away, but an ongoing mystery that continues to teach those willing to approach it with appropriate humility and patience. Imagine the pillars still buried, standing in darkness, maintaining their silent vigil through centuries and millennia, waiting for the moment when earth will be brushed away, and sunlight will touch their surfaces for the first time in 11,000 years. Imagine the creatures carved on their faces, foxes and serpents, vultures and lions, scorpions and boars still prowling through stone in chambers no living human has seen, holding meanings no living human can interpret, speaking in languages no living human can understand. What will those chambers tell us when finally excavated? Will they confirm what we've learned from the 5% already uncovered? Or will they overturn our carefully constructed theories, force us to revise our understanding yet again, prove that we were looking at everything wrong and need to start over with new assumptions and new questions? History suggests the latter is more likely. Each major archaeological discovery has tended to complicate rather than simplify, to multiply questions rather than settle them, to reveal how much we didn't know rather than to confirm what we thought we knew. For now, the pillars that have emerged into light stand as representatives of all that remains hidden. They speak for the sleeping stones, the buried circles, the uncounted hours of labor and devotion still sealed beneath the bella-shaped hill. They say, we are only the beginning, only the first whisper of a longer story, only the outermost layer of a deeper mystery. Listen to us, yes, but remember that we are fragments, that our siblings sleep beneath your feet, that what you see is only the smallest portion of what is here, what waits, What will outlast your interest and your theories and perhaps your entire civilization? And we, brief visitors to this long moment, can only wonder what else waits beneath our feet, what other revolutions in understanding sleep beneath every landscape we think we know. Göbekli Tepe is likely not unique, but simply the first such site to be discovered, the harbinger of others that might yet emerge from Earth to challenge our assumptions about when civilization began, and what forms it took, and whether the story we've been telling about our past has any relationship to what actually happened in the long centuries before writing turned history into text and text into truth. As consciousness descends toward sleep, toward its own temporary burial in dreams, the sleeping chambers of Göbekli Tepe whisper their patient reminder. Not everything worth knowing can be known right now. Not every mystery should be solved immediately. Not every secret should be revealed before its time. Some things must wait. Some things must sleep. And perhaps when they finally wake, when the earth is finally brushed away and the pillars emerge blinking into light, we will be ready to receive what they have to teach, or perhaps we won't. And the revelation will be wasted on us. And the pillars will wait for yet another generation, more patient than stone, more certain than stars, more enduring than any civilization that has ever risen thinking it would last forever. After all the excavation and interpretation, after the scholarly papers and the tourist visitors, after the revised textbooks and the documentaries, after carbon dating and ground-penetrating radar and careful analysis of every carved creature and positioned stone, one question remains luminous in its refusal to be answered, brilliant in its resistance to our best theories, essential in its stubborn persistence. Why? Why did people who had not yet discovered agriculture spend generations carving pillars and arranging stones in circles? Why did they invest such massive labor in monuments to the invisible when survival required constant attention to the visible, when every day brought urgent demands for food and shelter and protection from predators and weather? Why temple before city? Why ceremony before settlement? Why sacred before practical? Why build for gods or spirits or cosmic patterns when the immediate needs of the body must have been so pressing, so constant, so impossible to ignore? Perhaps the question itself is flawed, built on assumptions these ancient pilgrims would not recognize, structured by categories that didn't exist in their worldview. Perhaps they did not separate sacred from practical the way we do, did not see ceremony as something added on top of survival, but as integral to it, as essential to thriving as hunting or gathering or finding water or any other activity that kept them alive in a world that offered no guarantees. Perhaps ceremony was survival for them. Perhaps worship was the most pragmatic act they knew, the thing that bound scattered bands into larger communities, that created networks of mutual obligation and shared meaning, that transformed competition for scarce resources into cooperation toward common goals. Perhaps in gathering to raise stones and carve creatures, they were binding communities that would later become cultures. creating shared narratives in a world that might otherwise have fractured into 1,000 isolated bands of wanderers who never learned to trust anyone beyond their immediate kin. Or perhaps they simply felt what we still feel in the presence of sunset or storm, in moments when beauty or terror cracks the daily surface and reveals something beyond the ordinary, beneath the mundane, more real than the reality we usually inhabit. Perhaps they felt that impulse toward reverence, toward marking the sacred, toward saying in stone what cannot be said in breath. This matters. This is holy, remember. Remember not just in the sense of recalling the past, but in the deeper sense of remembering, of putting back together what has been fragmented, of making whole what has been broken, of reconnecting earth and heaven and human in the unified pattern that existed before separation. That might exist again if we could only remember how to perceive it. Göbekli Tepe offers no final answers, only invitations to wonder. It stands in the Anatolian dust, asking us to question every certainty we carry about progress and civilization, about when humanity became human, and what that becoming required. It suggests that the neat linear narrative we've been taught from primitive to advanced, from savage to civilized, from ignorant to enlightened, might be a fiction we've told ourselves to justify the path we took and the things we lost along the way. In the shadows of these pillars, we might discover that we are not the culmination of a linear journey from worse to better, but merely the current expression of consciousness that has always been asking the same questions, building the same temples, reaching toward the same mysteries we will never fully comprehend. We might discover that what we call progress was actually trade-off, that we gained certain things, cities and surplus, writing and technology, complexity and specialization, but lost other things that might have been equally valuable. Freedom and connection to landscape, ceremony and connection to cosmos, mystery and connection to forces larger than ourselves. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive. They were humans with full human consciousness, capable of abstract thought and symbolic representation, of planning and cooperation, of devotion and vision. They chose to invest themselves in creating sacred space, which tells us something profound about their values, about what they considered worth the enormous effort required to move 16-ton pillars without wheels or metal or domesticated animals. They chose ceremony over comfort, sacred over secular, mystery over the illusion of control. And in making those choices, they created something that has outlasted every empire that has risen and fallen in the 11,000 years since they laid down their stone tools and walked away from the Bella-shaped hill, leaving their questions carved in pillars that would sleep for millennia before waking to challenge every assumption their distant descendants would make about the past and about themselves. Perhaps the why of Göbekli Tepe is not something we can answer in words, not something that translates into the linear logic of explanation and justification. Perhaps it can only be felt, experienced, sensed in moments when we stand among the pillars, or look at photographs of them, or simply close our eyes and imagine what it must have been like to be human before cities, before walls, before the world was divided into mine and yours, and the sacred required buildings to contain it. Perhaps the real answer to why is simply because humans need to mark what is sacred, because we are the species that builds monuments to mysteries we cannot name, because something in us responds to beauty and terror, and the ineffable with the impulse to create, to shape stone or sound or story into forms that will outlast us, that will carry forward some echo of what we felt when we stood at the threshold between ordinary and extraordinary, and chose to honor that threshold with our labor, our devotion, our willingness to invest ourselves in something larger than personal survival or individual satisfaction. As sleep approaches, and the questions begin their dissolution into the deeper questions that emerge only in dreams, Göbekli Tepe stands patient in its half-revealed state, 5% excavated and 95% still sleeping beneath earth. It asks us to sit with not knowing, to honor mystery rather than demanding answers, to approach the past with humility rather than certainty, to remember that we are not separate from these ancient peoples but continuous with them, that their questions are our questions, their mysteries are mysteries, their search for meaning and connection and transcendence the same search we pursue in our own fumbling modern way. The pillars wait in darkness and in light, buried and revealed, known and unknown, answered and endlessly answering. They wait with the patience of stone for us to stop demanding explanations and start feeling what they invoke, to stop trying to solve them and start letting them solve us, strip away our certainty, our modernity, our distance from the sacred, and leave us standing humbled and blessed in the presence of questions that have no answers but might have something better, might have the power to transform us, might have the grace to remind us what we've forgotten, might have the patience to wait for the moment when we're finally ready to receive what they've been trying to tell us all along. That we are small, that we are ignorant, that we are blessed beyond measure to live in a universe that remains mysterious after all our attempts to explain it, sacred after all our attempts to secularize it, infinitely deeper than we will ever be able to fully comprehend or control, or reduce to formulas and facts, and the comfortable illusion that knowing is the same as understanding. And so we come to the end of our journey through Göbekli Tepe, though endings are always illusions, and this temple suggests more than most that beginnings and endings are arbitrary markers we impose on cycles that continue regardless of our need for narrative closure. The pillars stand as they have stood for 11,000 years, patient witnesses to the parade of human certainty and uncertainty, theory and revision, knowing and not knowing, that has characterized every generation that has wondered about them. In our time with these stones, we have walked among circles that speak in geometry older than language, traced our fingers across creatures carved when the world was young, stood before hands that reach toward meanings we cannot grasp, and felt the weight of questions that grow heavier the longer we hold them. We have learned that our ancestors built temples before houses, worshipped before they farmed, understood the sacred long before they understood property or hierarchy, or the 1,000 structures that would eventually define what we call civilization. We have learned that 5% excavated means 95% still sleeping, that every answer reveals deeper questions, that the past is not a closed book, but an open mystery, that humility serves us better than certainty when we approach monuments built by people who saw the world so differently from us that translation fails, and all we have left is wonder, and the willingness to sit with not knowing as though not knowing might be its own kind of knowledge, might teach what answers cannot. What echo does Göbekli Tepe leave in us as we prepare to descend into sleep, into that small death we practice every night, into dreams where the boundary between then and now grows permeable, and we might walk among these pillars as they were when first raised, might participate in ceremonies lost to time, might feel what those ancient pilgrims felt when they gathered in circles and became something more than themselves. Perhaps the echo is this, that we are continuous with those who came before, that the questions they asked are still our questions, that the mysteries that drew them to build temples in wilderness are the same mysteries that draw us still. Though we've largely forgotten how to honor them, though we've built walls between ourselves and the sacred and convinced ourselves that the walls make us safe when they might only make us small. Perhaps the echo is a reminder that progress is not linear, that what we've gained we've also lost, that the journey from hunter-gatherer to agricultural worker to city dweller to whatever we are now has been neither inevitable nor unambiguously good, that other paths were possible and might still be possible if we could learn to see them, to imagine them, to create space for ways of being human that don't require the endless consumption and accumulation and destruction that our current path demands. Perhaps the echo is an invitation to mystery, a call to honor what we cannot know as much as what we can, to approach the past and the present and the future with the humility appropriate to beings who are small and temporary and fundamentally ignorant of most of what matters, who live brief lives in a universe so vast and old and strange that our best theories barely scratch the surface of its depths. The pillars stand in darkness and in light, speaking in stone, waiting with patience that transcends patience, holding space for questions that have no answers but might have something better, might have the power to transform those who ask them, might have the grace to remind us of what we've forgotten, might have the courage to insist that not everything worth knowing can be known through the methods we currently privilege, that some truths require silence and receptivity rather than analysis and explanation. As consciousness settles toward sleep, toward that temporary dissolution of the boundaries that define us during waking hours, the stones of Göbekli Tepe offer their final gift. The recognition that we are part of a much longer story than we usually remember, that we carry within us the impulses and questions and yearnings of every human who has ever looked at stars or stones or storms, and felt themselves in the presence of something beyond naming, beyond explaining, beyond the comfortable categories that let us pretend we understand the world we live in. Those ancient pilgrims who walked for days to gather at the Bella-shaped hill were not so different from us. They loved and feared and wondered. They tried to make sense of existence, tried to find meaning in the chaos, tried to create beauty and connection and purpose in a world that offered no guarantees. They built in stone because stone outlasts flesh, because they wanted to leave something behind that would speak to those who came after, that would say, "We were here, we mattered, we reached toward the sacred, and maybe, just maybe, the sacred reached back." And here we are, 11,000 years later, standing in the chambers they carved, tracing the creatures they etched into limestone, asking the same questions they asked, reaching toward the same mysteries they honored with their labor and their lives. The distance between us and them is 11,000 years, but in some ways it's no distance at all. We are them. They are us. We are all humans trying to make sense of the impossible task of being conscious in a universe that seems to have no particular interest in explaining itself to us. The stones remember. They hold in their weathered surfaces the touch of hands long turned to dust, the prayers of voices long silent, the ceremonies of a people who understood something about the sacred that we have spent civilization forgetting. They hold our forgetting, too, the long, slow process by which we traded mystery for certainty, ceremony for commerce, participation for observation, belonging for ownership. They hold the whole tangled story of human becoming, the choices we made and the paths we followed and the roads not taken that might have led to different destinations, different ways of being human, different relationships to earth and sky and each other. Let the stones stand. Let them speak their silent testimony to mysteries we cannot solve, but can honor with our attention, our humility, our willingness to not know. Let them remind us that we are small and temporary, that our certainties are provisional, that the universe is deeper than we can fathom and stranger than we usually dare to imagine. Let them hold space for the sacred in a world that has largely forgotten how to recognize it. Let them mark threshold between ordinary and extraordinary. Let them stand as proof that humans need more than bread and shelter, need beauty and ceremony and connection to something larger than themselves, need to reach toward the ineffable, and know themselves reaching even if they never quite touch what they're reaching toward. Sleep approaches now, that daily rehearsal for the final mystery, that small death we practice every night and wake from every morning, that threshold we cross alone and return from alone, that darkness we enter without knowing if we'll emerge. In sleep, the boundaries soften. Past and present merge. We might dream ourselves among the pillars, might walk as pilgrims walked 11,000 years ago, might feel the sacred in our bones the way they felt it, might remember for a few hours what we've spent civilization forgetting. And when we wake, the stones will still be standing. They will stand when we are gone, when our civilization has run its course, when the cities we've built have crumbled to dust, and new peoples with different questions stand among the pillars and wonder what we were thinking, how we lived, what we believed mattered. They will stand and they will wait and they will speak in the only language they know, the language of stone and silence and mystery that refuses to be solved, that insists on remaining question rather than answer, That reminds every generation that certainty is always temporary, and humility is always appropriate, and the universe will always exceed our ability to explain it, will always offer more mystery than we can possibly resolve, will always invite us to approach the sacred with reverence rather than mastery, with wonder rather than conquest, with the openness that allows transformation rather than the certainty that prevents it. This is Göbekli Tepe. This is the temple before time. This is where questions go to become eternal, where mysteries go to outlast explanation, where the sacred insists on its own terms and refuses to be reduced to anything smaller than itself. Rest now. Dream. Let the stones stand watch while you descend into the mystery of sleep, while you practice the letting-go that all of us must eventually master, while you remember in your bones what consciousness sometimes forgets. That we are small, that we are blessed, that we are part of something vast and beautiful and terrifying and holy, and that the stones remember even when we forget, hold space for the sacred even when we deny it. Wait with patience beyond patience for the day when we remember what we knew before we learned to be so certain, before we built these walls, before we forgot that everything, every stone, every star, every breath is threshold to mystery if only we have eyes to see it. Sleep well. The pillars are standing. The mysteries are waiting. And tomorrow, if we're fortunate, we might wake with some small echo of what those ancient pilgrims knew, some whisper of the sacred that survived the long night, some reminder that we are more than what we think we are, connected to forces larger than we usually acknowledge, capable of wonder if only we remember how to open ourselves to it. How to stand in the presence of stone and let it teach what words cannot say, what sleep might whisper, what mystery always knows. That we are here, briefly, blessed and bewildered, reaching toward something we cannot name but cannot ignore, building our own small monuments to the ineffable, and hoping they might speak to those who come after, might say across the distance of years or centuries or millennia. We were here, we wondered, we reached toward the sacred, and in reaching we became more fully human than we ever could have been if we had settled for certainty instead of embracing the beautiful, terrible mystery of being alive in a universe that refuses to explain itself, but invites us endlessly to participate in its unfolding. Good night. May your dreams be deep. May the mysteries hold you gently. May you wake tomorrow remembering that you too are part of this long story, this eternal reaching, this sacred dance between stone and starlight, between question and silence, between the human need to know and the universe's insistence that some things must remain forever mysterious, forever just beyond our grasp, forever inviting us to keep reaching even though especially because we will never quite arrive.